Hi everybody, welcome back. We just finished topic 3-4, 6 as a factor and also 7 as a factor. And we're going to move on to 3-1 now. So please make sure you're on the right topic when you go back to your workbook. For this video, you actually need 2 sheets. Both of them are titled 3-1. So let's take a look at this first note sheet. In this unit, we've already learned about the zero property, which tells us any factor times 0 is 0. And we've also learned about the identity property, which tells us that any number times 1 is that other factor. Here is another property, and it comes with a warning because it is pretty tricky, but it's really useful. And you've actually kind of gotten a sneak peek of this distributive property when we did 6 as a factor and also 7 as a factor. And what the distributive property says is that a multiplication fact can be broken into the sum of 2 other smaller multiplication facts. So what that means is that you can break a big fact into 2 smaller facts and then add those 2 answers to those 2 facts together. So for example, if we look over at this picture, we have the equation 7 times 4. We've got 7 rows of 4 for 7 times 4. And what they did is the same thing we did when we were talking about 7 as a factor, is that they broke that 7 up. Let's zoom in a little bit. They broke that 7 up into a 5 and a 2. So now we have 2 smaller equations. We've got that 5 times that 4 and that 2 times that 4. The 7 got broken up into a 5 and a 2. And that way we now do 5 times 4 and 2 times 4. This is exactly what we did when we were talking about 7 as a factor. And then when we go to solve that, we get 20 and we get 8, so that we know that the product for 7 times 4 is 28. So one factor is always going to stay the same, so in this case we kept that 4 the same in both equations, and then the other factor was broken up into 2 numbers, and in this case it was the 7 broken up into a 5 and a 2. So let's take a look at another example. So we always want to think, what is our original equation? So in this case, we've got a 4 rows of 5. So our original equation is 4 times 5. Now, in actuality, if I saw a 4 and a 5, I know that I can solve this really quickly by using that 5 to skip count. But for the sake of practicing, let's go ahead and use the distributive property to solve this. And again, the distributive property means we're going to take this fact and break it up into 2 smaller facts. And we can do that many, many, many different ways. So when I look at this, I'm going to think which would be the best way to do it. And I think that if we broke it up like this and broke that 4 into a 2 and a 2, it would make this equation, this problem really easy to solve. So now let's take a look at what we have. We broke that 4 up into a 2 plus a 2. So I'm going to write that down on this line, 2 plus 2, and then we're still multiplying by 5. And then my next step is to distribute those to the other factor. And distribute means kind of like to hand out. So I'm going to give that 2 to that 5, 2 times 5, and then I'm going to make the next equation 2 times 5. So that 2 is coming over here, and the 2 is coming there. My 5 stays the same, and that 4 is now secretly broken up into a 2 and a 2, which makes this equation really easy to solve. 5 times 2 is just 10, and 5 times 2 over here is 10, to give me my final answer of 20. Because this one is pretty tricky, we are actually going to practice it a few more times. So let's take a look at what we have. So grab that second sheet, and we're going to solve this a couple of times. Remember, this is tricky, doing the distributive property, and we only want to use it when it's going to work best for us. So when we review these factors, I immediately see one that I would not use the distributive property for. I would use my 5's fact down here. And even in case like this, I might use the distributive property in a way that works best for me. Whenever I think about using the distributive property, I always think about the factors that work best for me, that I love the most because they're the easiest to work with. And those factors that I find easiest to work with are 2, 1s, 5s, and 10s. Whenever you can use the distributive property to make your equations with one of these factors, you know those are going to be the easiest for you. And I'll show you what I mean as we go through. So for example, when I look at that 6 and that 8, I want to think, what number am I going to keep the same and which number am I going to break up? So I can do this so many different ways. I can break my 8 up into a 4 and a 4. I can break it up into a 5 and a 3. I could even make a 7 and a 1. But I want to be clever when I do this so that I'm getting two equations that have really easy factors. And I can break up either one. It's up to me. So when I see these two factors, I immediately see that 6, and I know that 6 can be broken into a 5 and a 1. And those are two of the easiest factors to work with. 5s, I just skip count by 5s, and my 1, I know the identity property, and I know 1 times any factor is just the other factor. So this is, I think, the best strategy for me, but in reality, you could break it up so many different ways, and you're still going to get the same answer. So in this case, I now have a 5 plus 1 times that 8, and my 8 is staying the same. I only break up one factor. And now when I go through and I distribute, I'm going to have two more equations. I'm going to have 5 times 8 and 1 times 8. Now, looking back, I know that my 8 has stayed the same as one of my factors, and now my 6 is kind of a secret identity with that 5 and that 1. So that 6 is still there, but it just looks a little bit different. And now when I go to solve this, it's really easy for me because I can do 5 times 8. I can just skip count by 5s. 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40. And then 1 times 8 is a piece of cake. It's just 8. And I get my total of 48. And this is a more efficient way, more mathematical way than just drawing out a picture or doing my repeated addition. It's a lot fancier and a lot more efficient for me. So let's take a look at our next problem, 5 times 7. In reality, of course, I would just skip count by 7 to get my answer of 35. But in this case, let's practice using the distributive property. So looking at these, I know my 7 can be broken up into a 5 and a 2, and both of those factors are really easy for me to work with. So those are the factors I like to stick with. And then when I go through and I distribute out each one of those to the 5, I know I'm going to have a new equation of 5 times a 5 and a 2 times a 5. So this factor stays the same here, and now that 5 and that 2 are secretly my 7 over here. And then when I go through and solve this, I can do 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, and then I can just double that 5 and get 10, which brings me to my product of 35. All right, we have one more practice problem down here. Here we have a 7 and a 6. So at this time, you can decide which factor you want to break it up, and then also after you decide which one, how are you going to do it? If you are ready, pause the video and give it a shot, breaking up one of these factors and then solving it all the way through. And when you want to check your answer, come on back and we'll see how you did. All right, so taking a look at this, I actually can break either one up into really simple equations. I can break that 7 up into a 5 and a 2, or I can break that 6 up into a 5 and a 1. It's really up to me. No matter how you do it, you're going to get the same answer as long as all of your calculations are correct. So I think breaking the 6 up into a 5 plus a 1 is my best bet because it's very, very easy. And then I'm going to distribute to make my two new equations. So I know that 7 is not changing. It's going to be both in both equations. And then my 5 and my 1 are my secret identity for my 6. And then I'm able to have my two equations. And then I just remember that I'm going to add them together at the end. So when I skip count by 5s, I get 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35 over here. And then my identity property tells me that 1 times 7 is just 7. And then I can even use the standard algorithm of addition to find my final answer. 3 plus 1 is 4. And I should end up with 42 as my final answer. Now, the distributive property is tricky. There's so many places that we can make errors. We want to make sure we are doing it very neatly and very slowly. To recap, whenever I'm doing the distributive property, I can take one large fact and actually break it up into two smaller facts to make it easier for me to solve. Whenever I do this, I only break up one of the factors. In this case, we broke up the 6 and kept the 8 the same in each equation. Here we broke up the 7 and we kept the 5 the same in each equation. And then finally down here, we kept our 7 the same in both and broke up the 5. When you go through and practicing, there's going to be times where you're actually taking an equation and you're breaking it up into two smaller ones. And there may be times where actually they give you the broken up equations and say, what was the original? And in order to do that, what we would do is we would look at both of our mini equations and see what factor is the same in both. And in this case, it's the 7. And then we take a look at the other two factors to see what they add up to. So if I were going in the reverse, I would notice my 7 is the same. So I would have a 7. And then I look at my two other factors and I add them together. 5 plus 1 is 6. And I come right back to the original equation. When looking at this one, I notice I have 5 in both. So I know it's going to be times 5. And then when I look at my other two factors and I add it up together, 5 plus 2 is 7. And that brings me right back to my 5 times 7. This is a strategy that definitely takes some practice. You will make mistakes throughout the process, but hopefully the more you practice, the more it will begin to make sense. And again, this is a really great strategy for when we're working with larger numbers, particularly when we're working with things like 9, or in the future when you're working with 11s or even 12s. I hope this helps, and good luck working through the distributive property, and I will see you back here for the next video. Have a wonderful day. Goodbye.